is that there were often objects that that would support the existence of these beings. Unicorns, in particular, they were not just part of a kind of a mythological belief system; they were also part of a medical system. Ground-up unicorn horn was very good at purification, purifying water, purifying health, right? And oftentimes you would have traders who would monopolize on this belief.
The Codega is a guide and a storyteller, escorting you through the night, lighting the way, warding off thieves, ghosts, demons, and other oddities. Along the journey, his companions would often share with him the most curious of stories that he'd record in his Codex. Perhaps you just might find yourself traveling with the Codega and sharing one of yours. In the year 1356, an English knight named Sir John Mandeville wrote of his travels to distant lands filled with strange and terrifying creatures. He spoke of the Dogheads, humanoid beings with the heads of snarling hounds who were said to live beyond the edges of the known world. He described wild men of the forests covered in hair who live outside civilization and possess uncanny strength. He warned of one-eyed giants, reminiscent of the ancient cyclopses who roamed deserted islands and devoured unwary travelers. These weren't just ramblings of a medieval storyteller. To those who lived in Europe during the Middle Ages, these beings were more than myths. They were possibilities lurking just beyond the horizon, inhabiting the pages of illuminated manuscripts and whispered legends. But why did medieval people believe in these monsters? And how have they endured in our imaginations even today? Welcome back, everyone, to Codega's Codex of Curiosities, where we explore the strange, the forgotten, and the unexplained. I'm Bry, the Codega, your guide through the mysterious corridors of history and folklore. And tonight, we're diving into the world of medieval monsters, the strange and fearsome beings that haunted the minds of people in the Middle Ages. Were they just products of superstition, or did they serve a deeper purpose in society? Were they really there? Now, that's something we're going to jump into. But before we get there, I just want to say thank you to everyone for tuning in. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and share this show with your friends, with your neighbors, with your family, whoever you think will enjoy it. And tonight, joining me, I have Ben Stimpson, an integrative therapist, researcher, and author of Ancestral Whispers, a guide to developing ancestral veneration practices. You know, he spent years exploring the history of folklore, magic, and spirituality. And today, he's here to help us understand these myths, these legends in these medieval monsters. So with that, everyone, let's welcome Ben to Codega's Codex of Curiosities. Ben, welcome to the show. You are muted.
There we go. I had a weird thing happen to my headphones where they suddenly disconnected on me.
Yes, I was saying that earlier about how I was having issues with my mic, and it happened to you. Yes, it is something that is happening with StreamYard there. So welcome to Codega's Codex of Curiosities, Ben. Welcome, and tell our listeners and viewers a little bit about yourself and where they can find you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of live a double life because I know you introduced me as an integrative therapist, which is kind of how I make my living.
Yep.
But I also recently completed a bachelor's in medieval and classical studies. I also had a little bit of like kind of all over the place stuff in there too. And so my kind of professional work is in the realms of neo-paganism, but also studying witchcraft and medieval history and medieval folk practice and medieval folk belief. And it's something that a lot of people, it can feel such a long time ago. But when you actually look at it, it's only 500 years. And when we look at kind of the early modern period and then the modern period that we exist in, so much of those medieval beliefs are still with us. The way that we view the world, a lot of our urban legends are updated versions of those medieval beliefs, which are really updated versions of classical beliefs. So there's a lineage going back 2,000, 3,000 years The Bigfoot, for example, is a version of that wild man that you were talking about in your introduction, right? Which is a version of something much older, which is a version of something much older. So I particularly love the idea of folklore and really connecting in with folklore, because folklore is the genesis of culture. So I am so looking forward to talking about medieval monsters with you
So am I. So am I. I was very excited to have you come on, and when I saw this as a possible topic, I was like, yes, this is the where I'd like to go with this. I know you have a ton of other things we can cover, but this one is something that really I find super interesting. So I'm glad that we're able to take this now. Now let everybody know where they can find you. So you have
today.
a
Of
website,
course.
correct?
So I have several websites. The counseling website, you'll find that. But if you're looking for the work that we're talking about today, it's benstimpson.com. So that has information about my books. I have a couple of books coming out later in the year too, more folklore based on spirituality. I have a ton of classes. I have a YouTube account. I also have a podcast where I interview pagan and folklore authors as well. Kind of the Venn diagram of the world that I live in, and that can all be found on benstimpson.com.
Awesome, awesome, and all that information will all be in the show notes. So anybody who is interested in this, make sure you check out that show notes, whether it be in Spotify, Apple, or YouTube itself. We're going to find those all those links there. Click on them and go check out Benjamin Stimpson. And from there, let's jump into this. So medieval monsters. Where do we start?
Oh, that is a tough question, because I think we need to figure out, first of all, what is medieval. A lot of people have ideas about that period. Like the medieval period is something that scholars in later centuries came up with. People living in this period would have seen themselves as modern, present people, right? But medieval means middle age. So the middle age between the present, which is the 19th century when this term was founded and coined, and the classical period, the fall of the Roman Empire. So it spans roughly about 1,000 years, 500 AD to about 1500 AD. What makes it difficult is that it really depends on the culture, on the place, on the time. So medieval can shift around depending on what culture we're talking about. But generally, we're speaking, when people really think about it, we're thinking of the kind of the 500-year period from the 11th century to the 16th century. So that period where we have the Crusades, where we have, at the very end of it, the so-called Age of Exploration or the Age of Colonialism. This idea of kind of the Dark Ages is a very old term. It was actually a vibrant age, full of information, full of connection. There were trade networks all over the place. This is the route of the Silk Road, for example, right? Connecting Europe with Asia, or Silk Roads, I should say. So again, depending on where you're at, you'll have different kind of ideas of what medieval means. But generally, we're talking about a very Christian focused worldview. We're talking about a shared heritage that's connected in through things like the manuscript culture, through the stories of knights in shining armor, the chivalric age, right? And also the idea of the Crusades. This is a unified sense of Christendom against other outsiders or insiders, right? We're looking at Western Europe. Eastern Europe was certainly medieval, but their medieval age ran a little later. So you still had some idea of feudalism, for example, going well into the 18th, 19th centuries. And the medieval age ended when print culture started to come around. So this is when the printed books started to appear, when literacy started to really rise around the place, and you had the rise of Protestantism. So medieval Europe is really Catholic and Eastern Orthodox, whereas early modern is really Protestant. And that's important for the stories that we're going to talk about, right?
Amazing. Okay, so there
Yeah.
you just laid this groundwork for us.
Yes.
So this is the period, and I don't want to get off topic, but how did
Mhm.
Dark Ages come about? How did that term? Do you know why they called it the Dark Ages? Because a lot of people know the medieval times as the Dark Ages. Why was
Yeah.
that coined?
So it started to be coined in the late 1700s and really the Victorian age. And this is the time when scholars were starting to really put the pieces together again. These were people at places like Oxford and Cambridge and University of Paris, right? And so what they saw in this period was a generally dark age from what they were romanticizing and fanboying about, which was the classical Roman period. This was the fall of the Roman Empire, brought about a disunion of the Roman Empire, and so they saw it as a dark age when information kind of seemingly disappears. People were not writing down as much information as they were in the Roman period. Manuscript culture started to take effect, but it took a long time. So by the 1800s, documentation through this period, and really the Dark Ages is that like early period, medieval period. They just didn't know what was happening. It was very fragmentary. It was very legendary. A lot of the legends, like King Arthur, for example, emerges in this dark period, and so that kind of stuck. And then, as is so often the case, what starts in academia then filters out into popular culture and still is around 50 or 60 or 70 years after the term has stopped being used, right? Medieval, yeah, it's like Byzantine, for example, right? Is not something that any Greek or even Turkish people would call. They would not call that empire the Byzantine Empire. They call it the Roman Empire because that's how they identified themselves back then. Byzantine was a kind of a Western academic term, but now is everybody is using it.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Yeah. So you and
Yeah,
you were talking about these manuscripts. So a lot of these manuscripts were filled with like depictions of strange creatures and such. So
yeah,
where what do these monsters tell us about like the world view of these people, and where did they get these
yeah.
ideas to draw these in?
This is the cool thing. This is where it's like you can see the continuation. So, the if we take a manuscript from like 1400 and look at all the images of dogheads, of like, these fantastical creatures that exist in the margins, when you look at those, they're actually a lot of them from classical sources, particularly from the travelogues. So, you would have travel writers in Greece or Rome talking about far off places and saying what are the fantastical beings that exist in those places. What happened after the classical period is a lot of that material was still around. It was still part of the culture, and so a lot of Christian sources took them on, and they became kind of assimilated. So you have these beautiful, incredible maps. They're called Mappa Mundi. So these are the medieval maps, and they often are in like very specific shapes. So trifold is a very particular shape. You have the classical ideas of Africa, Europe, and Asia, right? In a set in a set pattern, and these mappamundis were not maps that you would take out to use in order to navigate the world. They were encyclopedias, and often they are filled with information about the world, including far off places, including all of these monsters that are said to exist there. So the medieval people really took on the classical notions and then added and continued to add to them. And so really, there was a belief there that they did exist. But there were also allegories too. There were quite a lot of metaphors and metaphorical creatures, and they were understood to be metaphorical as opposed to real. But then you had those other beings that were encountered, and they weren't understood. So they developed legends. Like, for example, one of my absolute favorites is the vegetable lamb of Tartary. And this is a plant that is supposed to have existed somewhere in the land of the Scythians, the Tartary, Tartarstan. Basically, you're looking at the kind of the Mongol steppes and kind of that Central Asian area, right? And it's this idea that this plant would grow a vegetable that looked and was woolly and looked like a little sheep. And then this little sheep would drop and go and eat all the plants around it. And once all the vegetation around these plants were consumed, the plant and these little vegetable lambs would all die. Now, there are theories that this probably was a cotton plant, because cotton didn't exist doesn't originate in North America or South America. It originates in the Old World. And when you look at this, you've got a tuft of what looks like wool on the top, right?
Yep,
So it's
correct.
this idea that, travel narrators were roaming through the field and they saw this plant growing. They didn't know what it was. So what did they logically think? Oh, well, this must be this must be generating lambs, right? So all of this kind of comes together. And it was a really, they were very logical people. This is something that a lot of people in the present day don't understand about people in the past, is that they had the exact same mental faculties that we have today. They they were approaching their world through logic, but that logic depended on information that they had, and their information wasn't, of course, what we have today. So, of course, if they see a plant like that with a tuft of hair on the top, they must think, oh, well, this must be generating some kind of animal, right?
Yep, yep.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That's interesting how they come to that conclusion by doing that. Yeah, and it's got this little acorn kind of looking thing, and that's where your cotton all is inside. Okay,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Now you mentioned the dog heads.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Let's. So I know it's also even dog-headed creatures or dogmen have been even. They appear in like religious texts as well.
Mhm.
Now, what do we know about them? Where did this come from, and what do we know, or what do you know through this all?
So the Latin term, or I should say the Greek term for them is cynocephali, right?
Okay,
And that is dog-headed beings. They exist in antiquity. They were talked about by Pliny. They were talked about by quite a lot, like not as far back as Herodotus, but Pliny certainly 2,000 years ago talked about them in his natural history. And they were always believed that they're perhaps one of the most famous groups in all of medieval like lore, because they were always believed to just be over the hill. They were always just in another country, but they never were really pegged down anywhere. A lot of questions developed about them because they were very much believed to exist. Certain trade products were believed to come from them. So, black pepper, for example, was believed to grow in the region where they controlled. And there are some fabulous images of dogheads picking pepper and producing pepper in some of these old manuscripts, particularly herbals. Um, and they were they were supposed to be bestial, but there was also question about whether or not they had souls. And there was a very famous letter from an Anglo-Saxon what you call it, missionary back in the 10th century, and he wrote to his bishop and asked, do we know if these dog-headed beings have human souls? Are they humans just in a very different form? Because if we encounter them as we go off into Scandinavia somewhere, do we missionary, like do we proselytize to them? Because of course, from a Christian worldview, it is your duty to proselytize when you come across somebody who hasn't heard the word. And the bishop said, they probably do have human souls. They wear clothing, they live in villages, and that is a sign of humanity, as opposed to animals who don't have that sense. So they were really using their sense of logic here based on what they were being told and understood. But it was a very serious thing. These were not beings that were just understood to be, oh, they're just metaphors, they're just allegories. And there's a really good important point to that, because the medieval worldview, we have it still here now, right? Is that anything ancient must be true because it's so old and it's carried through, right? Think about, in our present day, how many times like do politicians harken back to, the founding fathers, or the old kings, or the older something is, the more true it could be. And so then, you've got 2,000 years of Senesophaly, um, and every so often there would come, some really interesting example. Like a really really clear example of this is there is an Eastern Orthodox icon of Saint Columb of Saint yeah Saint
Saint
Christopher.
Christopher. Yeah.
Yes, Saint Christopher. I said Saint Columba. I was talking about Saint Columba earlier. So Saint Christopher, And there was the theory of this is that there was a misunderstanding when someone was translating a text with his name. There was a confusion with his name, and there was a linkage there to Cynocephali. And so there's an icon of him as a doghead. There was a belief that some of the Roman emperors had Cynocephali guards, and so you have these images from very, very, very early manuscripts of dogheads in Roman gear because they were the emperors, henchmen. So yeah, they were always somewhere, but they were never here. And so when Marco Polo went on his adventure, he kept asking, "Where are the dogheads?" And whenever he met anyone in Asia, they would say, "Oh, we thought that they exist over where you live," because they also have that parallel tradition. It's interesting how many of these specific monsters exist in Asian tradition and in Western tradition. The other good example of that is there's another form of being which are heads that are in the bodies. I can't
Yes,
remember what they're called right
I
now.
can't
You've
remember the
seen
names.
this?
I know exactly
Yeah,
what you mean. Yeah, they don't have a head like
yeah.
as we do, but their faces are
Are
in their
in their
body, in their
chests, in
chest.
their chests,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
What's fascinating is in a bestiary from China, a very, very famous bestiary, and it's something called like the 1001 Days or something like that. I'd have to check. It's been a while since I looked at my notes. But this being exists in that. There are also a certain yokai from Japan, which is also in this form. And so you've got these traditions and also Western traditions. So theories are like, where is this come from? There's probably all sorts of theories as to why, but people legitimately believe that these creatures existed there, right? When the in the 16th century, when the Spaniards were looking for El Dorado in South America, they honestly believe that they would run into some of these creatures, right?
Really. So
Yeah.
so I know that these are perhaps fables and folklore, but when we have people actually saying that they've ran into them, where does it go from there? Does it come out of the texts and come out of the books and it comes into reality? Does it actually become reality?
I think that I mean, this is where we have to be very careful about, if people are saying that they saw them, they may have seen something and they interpreted it that way. They may have also been looking. And so when people go looking, they often find, even if what they're looking at isn't necessarily the same thing, right? It's one of those, it's a lived and believe, it's a belief system. But also, there are also writers who would be creating stories and exaggerating in the same way that we have them now. We have people who will say that they saw something, and as part of that, it's part of that wanting to belong, parting, that expectation of, oh, you went on a journey, you must have seen something. Oh yeah, no, I saw it, yeah, and it was really, and then they start to believe it themselves. There's a whole psychology around it, right?
True,
Um,
true.
as I said, the medieval people were as logical as we are, and even then there were people who were skeptical and that would actively, argue against something or question things, even though they lived in a very kind of supernaturalist culture. Supernatural was everywhere, and you could expect if you went out the door at night that you might run into something, right? It wasn't a secular culture as we exist in now. I hope
Interesting.
that
Okay.
answers the question. Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I did look up the creature there, the headless man.
Mm-hmm.
Blemmies, is that seem right?
Blennies. Yes. Yes.
Blemmies.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. That
Yeah.
sounds right. The headless man. Yeah.
Yeah, they are quite interesting. Like I wonder where that originated from. Where did that
Mm-hmm.
come from? I don't know. It is fascinating. And when we're talking about like the dog-headed creatures as well, spanning, you know, different cultures, different generations, different
Mm-hmm.
areas. We also have Anubis as the dog-headed
Yes. I'm glad you
god.
raised him.
And
Yes.
yes, so
Yeah.
there's many stories about this.
Well, and like, that translates then into werewolves, that translates into other kinds of creatures, right?
Yeah.
And,
Yes.
the idea of like, we have ruins everything is built on top of itself, right? We have ruins
Yes.
in Egypt that vividly show these creatures, right? If you're a Greek going down there during the Ptolemaic time, right, and you're studying these ancient carvings and you see these dog-headed, animal-headed beings, then I think you can easily like conclude, oh well, these must be real, and then that translates into other cultures and so on, right? Bess, there's an Egyptian god named Bes, which originally came from the Middle East, Mesopotamia. And when you look at the physicality of that, it's a little dwarf and the head is a little shrunken in. I think that, anybody who's viewing that, who was going in with the mindset of these beings must exist somewhere, oh, there's the proof, I can see that, right? I
Yeah.
think in the same way that again, modern people do, confirmation bias, right?
100%. Yes. Confirmation
Yeah.
bias happens all the time. And,
Yeah.
and that's something that we always have to be aware of. Like there's a lot of people now these days when they go out Bigfoot hunting or something like that, and they see something and they're like, instantly it's Bigfoot. And I just posted something on my Facebook group yesterday. Someone had gone out to near a creek bed, and it was all muddy, and they saw footprints, and they're like, this is a juvenile Bigfoot and a and a teenage one or something like that. And I was like, well, if I'm walking in a muddy creek area and I'm wearing my flip flops, I'm going to take my flip flops off because they're going to rip, and
Yeah.
I'm going to be walking in barefoot. So we have to be aware of what we're seeing and not think that
Yeah.
everything is what we want it to be. And
Completely.
yeah, I had gone hiking. I actually went barefoot hiking in Costa Rica through the jungle. It was muddy, so I'm going to be leaving footprints everywhere. And I'm like, sorry if anybody was hunting or searching for Bigfoot at that time. It was
Yeah.
just me. It was just me. So I do agree. We have to have a healthy dose of skepticism when we're
We
out
do.
looking for these
Yeah.
things. Yeah.
Yeah, we do, but we also, and the second point there is, we also have to be very cautious of not projecting presentism back into the past. This happens a lot, particularly with certain types of study, is that an 18th century or 19th century scholar comes up with an idea, an explanation to try and rationalize these beliefs, writes it down, and then subsequent writers pick that up as being, oh, well, that must be the way that they actually saw this is an explanation. And when you actually go back to the original sources, as I do, um, you can see that there was an actual lived belief here. It wasn't that they were confusing anything. It was that they were legitimately believing that something existed there. It wasn't metaphorical. It wasn't allegorical for them. And so belief generally does create experience, right? So they experienced something, but the belief was there, right? Versus they were seeing this only as allegorical, and so they didn't actually believe that they were encountering the wild man of the woods, right? Well, no, they encountered a wild man of the woods. The reality of that wild man of the woods might not be the same as what they were believing, but they believed that they were experiencing that, right?
Okay. So the wild
Yeah,
man of the woods.
yeah.
Let's go into that. So, who do you believe the wild man of the woods are, and how did they reflect in medieval like fears or
Yeah.
desires?
This is where we get into conversation then around kind of the different stratas of society, right? So I want listeners to imagine the culture of medieval age, right? First of all, literacy was not the way that most people gained information. It was an oral culture, which in many ways is a lot more efficient at giving information and transmitting information than the written word. So written word was mostly for the clergy and the monastic tradition. That was really the keeper of the written word. And then the nobility was connected to that. So this is where we get, the manuscript culture. Most people would have been encountering things either through hearing or through seeing or experiencing, right? So whenever they went into a church, the ancient medieval churches were not like how we see them now, which are all whitewashed. You would have gone in and they would have been very similar to an Eastern Orthodox church, filled with imagery. They would have been completely like there would have been frescoes, there would have been scenes from the Bible, there would have been sometimes local history scenes, right? And it was completely filled. And a lot of these motifs, like the wild man, would have been painted. There's a wonderful example of this I believe, in Denmark, and it is a restored medieval Catholic church. And you go in, and there are dragons on the wall, there are wild men, there are creatures, there are demons, they're everywhere, because that's how best to give the information and to tell the stories, right? So when people entered that space, they were in that sacred space. They were being told stories from the Bible by the priest who was possibly literate. Quite a few priests back then weren't. They were just going by memory, which is one of the aspects of oral culture. Memory and memorizing is a huge part of the oral culture. So they would have been seeing the scenes on the wall of wild men. They would have been hearing the kind of interpretation of those wild men from the priest, and then they would have believed that yes, there are wild men in the woods. Now, if you were only to look at the manuscript culture, there's a lot of interpretation of the wild man motif, which is that they represent a form of savagery, that they are innocent, that they are a lower form of life, but are really there to reflect back morality and virtues to humans. Everything in the world, this is the worldview of the medieval people and the classical people to begin with, was that the world around us was a reflection of divine will. And this is why things like astrology was a science, because by carefully looking at the movements of stars, you could deduce information, hidden information about the will of God. And the will of God was really the rules of everything, right? And so by doing that, you're looking at animals, for example. This bestiaries and herbals are very good at this. They would tell you what is the moral lesson connected to certain animals. The animals have their own separate lives, yes, but beavers, for example, behave a certain way and have a certain kind of attribute to them because they're really trying to teach us humans a certain thing about God's will, right? That was the belief system. So wild men, whether or not, you believe that you would encounter wild men in the woods or that they were metaphorical, they figured they had a moral lesson to you. And of course, if there's a moral lesson there, why wouldn't they exist? Why would God just create a symbol and not have it manifest in the world around you?
Okay.
Right?
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
And okay, so let's move on to something else that comes up very often is like you said dragons. Okay.
Yeah.
Where did that come from, or do we want to go in the route of unicorns? Because unicorns as well is something, this mythical beast that, where did they come up with these ideas? How did they, and is that just from the history from the past that they just regurgitated, or was it something new to them at that time?
Well, I think certain things were new to them, right? So certain traditions around unicorns, like for example, and you see this in medieval tapestries often, is the hunting scene. So unicorns had a certain medicinal quality to them because of the virtues that they embodied. And so there was this idea that in order to trap a unicorn, to get a unicorn, and this was a belief that they existed widespread at one point, was you placed a virgin in a meadow and the unicorn was believed to come out and lay its head in the virgin's lap because of the Virgin Mary being the prime mother, right? And at that point, then the hunters could come and capture the unicorn. Um, Unicorns and dragons were much older. You have some fabulous creatures in classical texts, and dragons in particular have been around for centuries and centuries and centuries. Not in the form that we have now, where they're winged and they have four legs and they're fire breathing, but there is a long history of kind of large reptiles. Down in Egypt, you had, the ancient crocodile gods and the lizard gods, right? In Mesopotamia, you had various serpent deities. Same with a lot of Indo-European traditions have this idea of the serpent deity of the ground versus some sort of sky deity, right? And uh, so there's a natural evolution from that. That doesn't mean that somebody sitting in like 1136 would have known that. They wouldn't be thinking, well, I'm seeing the dragon on the wall. That's really connected to the ancient pagans from 2,000, 3,000 years ago. They wouldn't have done that. They would have seen it from their own cultural standpoint. But they believe that they existed. And this is a really cool part of materia culture in medieval age, is that there were often objects that that would support the existence of these beings. Unicorns, in particular, they were not just part of a kind of a mythological belief system; they were also part of a medical system. Ground up unicorn horn was very good at purification, purifying water, purifying health, right? And oftentimes you would have traders who would monopolize on this belief. One of the best examples is in Germany. You've got a couple of imperial unicorn horns, and what they actually are narwhal tusks. Yeah,
Wow. So
yeah,
then they
they're
would.
narwhal tusks.
That is cool. Yeah, I was
Yeah,
thinking that like, how would they pass that off as, listen, we have this, and I was thinking like, well, rhinoceroses, but those are not really exactly what you want. Whereas
no.
the
Whereas the
narwhal tusk,
narwhal horn, it's perfect, right? I mean, and this is the thing. This is what how big and connected the medieval world was. You had Norse traders set up a colony in Greenland in like the 1100s, no 900s, right? That colony lasted for almost 600 years. There were Norse settlers in Greenland for almost 600 years before they died out. But from them, they were hunting narwhals and they were hunting walruses, trading with Iceland, trading them with other Scandinavian countries, and then it would just be passed along until it eventually got to Germany or continental Europe. By that time, right, nobody had seen a narwhal in continental Europe because it's too far north. So there's no proof otherwise than, oh well, this is this is a unicorn horn, right?
cool. Okay,
Yeah,
that's interesting. Now,
yeah, it's really cool. Yeah.
yeah, it really is. Now is there I'm just trying to think about the cyclopses. Let's jump to the cyclopses, where that originated from, because that's
Yes.
also giants and cyclopses.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Yeah, this is a tough one because, like with Cyclops, particular, absolutely classical. They come straight from the stories of Troy and Odysseus and like the epic cycles, right? And this is the cool thing with the kind of the way of that culture is that you often find cyclopses in manuscripts because the nobility of that time were really interested in the matter of Greece and the matter of Rome, right? So, ancient classical stories, even though they were pagan, they weren't forgotten. They were often in line with that whole like the high culture of the nobility because you had a lot of them were trying to claim descent from ancient Troy. Again, it's that belief that the older something is, the more authority you have, right? And because a lot of the Roman emperors also descended or claimed descent from ancient Troy, that was the goalpost. So if you could find your way back there through, perhaps a scribe, and there's a couple of monks who, were notorious forgers, you could get back there. And because the Cyclopses and Greek tradition had giants, and biblical sources also had giants, then the belief is that they were giants, right? So the Cyclopses, I mean, again, there's some theories that Cyclopses, the probably emerge from the reality of deformity and the I can't think what it's called now, but the particular condition that causes cyclopia, basically. Um, but there's also theories about elephants too. When you look at an elephant skull, when there's a cavity right in the center there, which looks like an eye cavity. And so somebody looking at that, if they were traveling in India, or if they were traveling in Asia, or Africa, that could very well be, misconstrued as a cyclops skull, right? That probably goes right back to those travel logs we were talking about.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so we covered Dogheads, we
Yeah.
covered Cyclops, we covered like the hairy man, the wild man. Now, I think you had mentioned earlier that something. Well, when we're off air, that witches can be tied into this as well. So
Yeah.
why don't we segue into the witches?
Of course, yeah, definitely. So again, this comes back to this idea of supernaturalism, right? Some of these beings that we've talked about were, mythological. They were taken up and they became figurative, right? Quite a few of these were understood to exist in the world around us. The medieval people didn't have a strong connection with the natural world because the natural world was still not under their control, right? If you went into the woods, you could encounter bears, wolves. There were all sorts of, up until the 1400s, there were aurochs, which were huge, massive bovine creatures, and they only went extinct in the 1400s after overhunting. But there was a lot of dangers in those woods, right? In the wild spaces, which is represented kind of like a fifth column. There was no separation between what could harm you in the domestic space and what could harm you in the wild spaces. Obviously, don't go wandering in the wild because you could be killed very easily by wild animals or by other creatures that exist out there. But they also could exist in towns and in villages and in settlements too. The devil was one of the biggest agitators to that. So as the centuries went by, as the medieval ages gave way to the early modern, you started to see the devil become more and more of a ridiculous creature. But in the earlier medieval period, he was a very serious threat, and he was a very serious threat through his agents, which were demons, but also witches. So witches in particular, there's a whole evolution there, but generally speaking, when you look at witches cross-culturally, they were believed in the medieval age to have sold themselves to the devil or gained some power from the devil in some way. And so they were blind to the devil. Now, I've got several books coming out on witches actually. Different cultures viewed them differently. In Wales, where I come from originally, which is a little part of just off the side of England there, witches were not seen to have sold their souls to the devil. It was more about what they did. So if you did malefic magic against your community, you were considered a witch with and there was a certain Welsh term for that. In English culture, which is really connected to European culture and cross-culturally, witches became something different. They became something more. They became hags. So you see that they're no longer considered human because of their affiliation with the devil. And so then you were constantly looking for certain signs. This unfortunately led in the early modern period to a lot of innocent women being accused of witchcraft because they had moles or they had a teat or they had a certain deformity or they had a powerful gaze, whatever ridiculous things it was. But in the medieval period, that was the hallmark of a witch. Also, I know it's from a modern standpoint, it seems so arbitrary. But when we get to the headspace of it, well, okay, suddenly we have plague. Who do we blame? Well, there must be evil people, evil witches, beings in this space doing this.
Exactly. Not sanitation, but we'll blame a person. Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
right. Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. And so then you get this idea, like in certain cultures, of like going even a step further, of witches as like hags and creatures of the night, and almost becoming demonic, essentially themselves. They were able to fly. They had imps, and they had demon familiars, right? Um, and they were always working against the community. They were not doing anything positive, which is has led to a lot of innocent people who practiced magic as a profession back then, being accused of doing evil as opposed to doing good. There was a whole other stream of magical practitioners who were, using folk remedies and folk charms, and there's in later centuries they started to emulate and started to use occult practices. You had monks in monastic spheres actually
Correct.
performing cult practices, right? Yeah,
Wow. Okay.
yeah.
And are those other practices, those other people, is that referred to as like the cunning folk? Is that where we
The
kind of
cunning folk, exactly. That's exactly it. The cunning folk. Yeah.
okay, okay.
Yeah, so the two books that I've or three books I should say, the two books, one of them is ready to come out in September. Focuses on the folklore of the cunning folk and of witches of Wales, and I have one organised for England as well. And you really see the difference between, and it's based on what they did as opposed to who they were in Wales, as opposed to in England, where a witch is what you were. It wasn't just what you did, and that was often determined by your relationship with the devil. In Europe, that's very similar to France, Spain to some degree also, and there was a common folk kind of belief in like the later medieval age that the devil had a school of magic in Spain. And where that has come from is that so many medical texts, ancient classical sources, and like algebraic texts. A lot of texts came in through the medieval Islamic caliphate that was down there, that was eventually conquered and thrown out. But you had tons of knowledge coming in. So this idea then in Toledo that the devil had a magic school down there, and that's where he taught all of his wizards and magicians and witches and whatnot, was probably a later folk narrative about those schools where actual scholars would go and learn algebra and astrology and all of those from Muslim clerics.
So you get educated, and that's the devil. That's evil. That's
Yeah,
crazy. Yeah,
yeah.
it's crazy how the world works like that. When you want to do research and you want to learn more, people seem to shun you for that. Even in our day and age too. You when I was growing up, you got caught in the library reading extra books, and kids would make fun of you or bully you for that very reason, which is it's just bizarre. When you want to better yourself, better your education, you are kind of ostracized from everyone else. Now, you went into a little bit of the cunning folk. That is something I've heard the term before, but I never really knew. And I did do some research prior to this interview. But if you let's go a little bit into the cunning folk, because why not?
Why not, right? I can talk and talk and talk about them. Yeah, the cunning folk are really interesting. A lot of neo pagans nowadays would see themselves as being like the cunning folk. The cunning folk were actually more like psychics in like any kind of psychic fair, or like a psychic little shop that you find in any street corner, right? That's what they were performing. They were performing certain tasks for the community. And when you look at the folklore, they become more and more and more ridiculous characters. They were seen as frauds, but back in the medieval, like late medieval period and early modern period, they would often be providing herbal cures. They would often be providing, and this is both men and women, mostly men when we think of cunning men, but it was a profession for that was non-gendered. Um, so you had like the wise women and then the cunning men, right? And so they were giving out herbal cures. They were using astrology to tell and inform local farmers when to plant their crops based on, the degrees of moon. And this is why when you open the farmer's almanac, you get astrological information, right? Yeah, so the almanacs have a huge key role to play in cunning folk. Cunning folk exist in both North America and Europe. When we think of like in North America, for example, you have in the south you have a conjurman, right? Or in Appalachia you have Yorub doctors, or any of those like faith healers. Faith healers started to emerge out and became like kind of took on the role of the cunning folk. Um, they were helping their community through magic and through spiritual means that a priest wouldn't be able to do, or that a reverend wouldn't be able to do. So while you had, prayer as a way of dealing with issues, you could also go to this secondary person who would also be able to kind of harness that spiritual resource. They were using occultism. They were using old like rituals. When Catholicism was really thrown out in many countries, and you had the Protestant Reformation, a lot of folk magic and charms were actually Catholic charms that kind of survived and then kind of went underground and continued, right? Certain things like putting um, putting certain branches up on some of the high feast days is a Catholic practice that then became a way of protection in folk magic, and the cunning folk would have been using things like that. They also probably, I mean, they were poor people. A lot of them were not highly educated. Highly educated, they were educated, but they wouldn't have gone away to school. Some of them did, but we're talking more than people like Dr. John Dee and like occultists who were practicing high ceremonial magic. The cunning folk would have been more in the community, and they often would be informing clients where evil is happening. And this is where you get in the 1600s, at least in England, a lot of the accusations come from. So a very typical example of this will be somebody falls ill. A family member goes to the local cunningman and asks them to do a divination to figure out what's happening. They do an astrological chart, or they do a ritual, or whatever it is that their shtick. And they say, the first woman that you meet when you leave this house will be the witch that caused this, right? So then, of course, the person goes out, sees a neighbor, because these are very small local communities, and you're like, oh, this neighbor and the person who got sick had an argument 10 years ago. Okay, she's cursed this person, right? And then there's a whole accusation process and move on. And you see this in witchcraft records. That always happens. There's some sort of disagreement. Somebody falls ill, and therefore the logic there is, well, she must be a witch, and she cursed him, and that's why. Yeah.
Wow.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
So it's kind of like, I'm not saying like the cunning folk are witches, but they're kind of like connected. You would be. It's kind of
Yeah,
strange that
they
you're
do.
kind of like throwing your
Yeah.
fellow person under
Yeah.
the bus, almost, so to
Yeah.
speak.
And
Yes.
this is where it becomes a really sticky point, depending upon the decade. It's by this point we're looking at the decade. We're looking at what is that fine line, because a lot of cunning folk were seen as potentially being able to do bad magic because they had that at their disposal, but they were mostly identified as doing good. So there's a biblical precedent to this. So it's this idea of like King Solomon, who in the occult tradition built the temple to God, the first temple, using demons that he was able to gain control over, and then create this temple to God. But it's okay, because even though he used demons to do it, it was for God, right? So that world view there of, okay, as long as they're doing it to help the community, they can consult, consult with spirits, they can consult with demons, as long as they have power over. And that's the occult tradition right there. The ceremonial occult tradition is, learning how to gain power over a demon, which is lower than humans on the spectrum, on the hierarchy, in the name of God. And then anything you do with that demon then is in the name of God. Therefore, it must be good, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Really interesting. Is what else? What else topics should we cover here? We got about another like 5-10 minutes. Is there any
Oh
else?
wow, yeah, no.
Yeah.
Well, so again, with that whole idea of cunning folk, right? A lot of our resources come from the 1600s because of print culture. Suddenly, you had a lot of material being written and surviving. Manuscripts, they talk a little bit about these beings, these people, but manuscript culture was for the nobility. So a lot of what's left in manuscripts um, really are for that high chivalric noble culture, which is really tied in with ancient Rome, really tied in with King Arthur and whatnot, and so So you see some crossover there. But when you get into print culture period, then we start getting some interesting things. We start getting things like stage plays being produced through like William Shakespeare's Weird Sisters in
Okay,
Macbeth,
yes. Yeah.
right? Yeah, he gained that story from a print book 70 years earlier from Scotland, which was a history of Scotland. And that, like, it's a historical moment, even though it's a legend, it's a historical moment. Shakespeare didn't write that, right? Same with The Tempest. He based his story on ideas Friar Bungie and Friar Bacon, with right, whose story was who appeared in chapbook form, right? Same with Faust, right? The legend of Doctor Johann Faust, right? That was translated from a print chapbook in the 1500s. And then very quickly, Marlowe came up with a stage play, and then it was being performed for people. And so when people were seeing this on stage, it affected their beliefs around this. And then suddenly you see the same elements of stories that are appearing in these productions suddenly show up in folklore 200 years later, and you can see the progression, right? But you also see it affecting the practices of cunning folk too. So suddenly you have cunning folk, particular cunning folk, if you open any of the folklore books from the 1800s, and I'm speaking particularly for English folklore here because that's my wheelhouse,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
you can see how elements of the stage plays from 200 years earlier have joined together with the actual history of what the practices were, and suddenly you have this larger than life figure who was, bringing demons forth through ceremony while also opening up his almanac and figuring out, what is the best way to, do the harvest and whatnot, right? From an astrological bent. So you've got a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And that is the focus of folklore. Folklore is always going to be like that. Legend developed like that. There's a little bit of history, there's a little bit of falsity, there's a lot of stuff in between, right?
Okay. Yeah. So, just to end this off, I do have one last question though. So,
Yeah.
with this medieval folklore, do you see any parallels between today's cryptids like Big
Yeah.
Man, Big Man, Bigfoot, and Dogman with the medieval folklore, medieval
Oh,
monsters? Like,
totally. Yeah.
where do you go with that? Because people are
Totally.
saying that they're seeing these things. We have some films of it. Where do we go with this?
Totally. So again, this is the thing. You know, we can answer this depending. Like, I'm a believer. I believe that there are supernatural beings around us all the time. I have a strong sense of that, even though I can turn that off and look at it from another point of view. I think that what we have here is perhaps really a telling of our basic psychology, right? Our basic psychology, like, has formed in such a way that if you see, a certain symbol on the wall and it looks like a face, that's pareidolia, right? We're predisposed to see things that may not be there, but might be there, right? I also do believe, again, that there are beings that are actively, interacting with the world. When you look at the consistencies, and there's a lot of work being done around this with UFOs and alien abduction stories and fairies, right? There's a lot of interesting theories going on there, but you often see some very similar kind of ideas. This idea that, well, maybe, fairy tradition and fairy encounters 500 years ago was actually an alien abduction. They just didn't know how to grasp it. So they, of course, saw it in the way that their culture allowed them to. The same could be true too. Maybe fairies are abducting us and we're just seeing them as little green men because of Roswell stories, right?
That's
You
interesting.
know,
That's very interesting
yeah,
take. That it could be fairies or it could be aliens. It could be
yeah,
they could be one and the same.
yeah. This is the thing. I think, like, urban legends is something I'm really, really fascinated by because, again, when you look at the motifs and what bubbles up in urban legends, you can see that those stories, there's something about psychology there, right? They're universal. And oftentimes, the same sort of energy connected with those stories will generate it again and again. What I love is, like, the internet stories that are emerging, how quickly that process is happening. When you slow that down, like Slenderman, for example, right, is a very good example of this, right? You have something that's being created, people then start to experience it, perhaps through at least in one case, it was a psychotic breakdown, but you have that belief, that opening up of belief. That's when you have creation suddenly become universal, because it detaches from the original creation. And folklore always happens this way. Something might have been created, but once it becomes, kind of connected to the community, it no longer, it kind of takes on that,
like its own life.
Mm-hmm. It takes on its own life, and the community is able to smooth it out so that it fits perfectly for the needs of that community, right? And so Slenderman fits a particular need for that community. It's just happening on a really quick event. We look at like tall tales, right? How quickly something on the internet is posted and someone says, "Oh, did you know this happened? Oh, did it happen?" And then 2 days later, people are talking about it, and it didn't happen. It was just an internet rumor. But how quickly that would have happened, slowed down 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, right? That would have taken a longer process, but it still happened that way.
Really interesting. Benjamin, I want to say thank you so much for joining us here today. And one last time, why don't you tell everybody where they can find you?
Yeah, so www.benstimpson.com. That has all of my links on there, YouTube page, social media, classes, and I've got a couple of interesting talks on my YouTube page for people to go and see. I also have a backlog on my Patreon that has most of my classes on there that people can go and see the recordings of those classes. So people can subscribe. It's just a one-time kind of monthly subscription. You have unlimited access. I can't guarantee that I'll put stuff up every month, but it's there if people want to have access. So
awesome. Thank you so much again, Benjamin. I really appreciated it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right, everyone. That there was Benjamin Stimpson, and I want to say thank you for him coming out. It was a fascinating dive into the world of like folklore, magic, medieval monsters, and these figures who have shaped our legend. From the cunning folk and witches to cyclopses and dog-headed creatures. So again, Ben, thank you so much for joining us and shedding light onto these enchanting and often maybe perhaps misunderstood figures. So your insight was significant, and it's been truly enlightening. So again, to all our listeners, I hope this conversation has inspired you to take a closer look at the ancient stories that still affect us today in our world. Whether you're fascinated by folklore or history or magic that still lingers in our collective consciousness, there's still always more to uncover, and sometimes it's not what you think it is. It could be something else that we are making up, and it's not really what you believe it is. So again, everyone, thank you for tuning into Codega's Codex of Curiosities. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe and share, especially if you found tonight's episode intriguing. So until next time, keep your curiosity wandering, keep the light lit, and always find your way home.
Beneath the stars where shadows grow, the Nephilim's echoes whisper low. Bigfoot roams through the forest deep, and Dogman prowls where the brave won't sleep. Across lost history we wonder why, seeking the truth that time tried to hide. Keep your curiosity wandering and the light lit, through the darkness don't ever quit. In the Codex, the mysteries come, and always find your way back home. UFOs streak through the velvet skies, aliens watch with unblinking eyes. The paranormal hums where silence breaks, in the void of secrets a lantern wakes. Through hidden realms and stories untold, the Codex flame is a light to Curiosities wandering in the light lit. Through the darkness, don't ever quit. In the Codex, the mysteries calling. Always find your way back home. UFO streak through the velvet skies. Aliens watch with unblinking eyes. The paranormal hums where silence breaks. In the void of secrets, a lantern wakes. Through hidden realms and stories untold, the Codex flame is a light to hold. Keep your curiosities wandering in the light lit. Through the darkness, don't ever quit. In the Codex, the mysteries come and always find your way back home. Legends rise from the Earth's deep core, a lost legacy we can't ignore. With every step, the veil grows thin, revealing worlds where the strange begins. Keep your curiosities wandering in the light lit. Through the darkness, don't ever quit. In the Codex, the mysteries come and always find your way back home. Giants, cryptids that come